How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Case Lead podcast. Again, I have Fahim Rahman here with me, my esteemed colleague. I'm going to give a quick intro again.
Sure. I'm Fahim Rahman. I'm the managing attorney at the law office of Fahim Rahman. I'm a plaintiff side employment lawyer. I handle pretty much exclusively employment law, wrongful terminations, discrimination at work, whistleblower retaliation, things of that nature.
Sweet. And my name is Aman. I am the CEO and co-founder of Casely.ai. So, Fahim, what are people going to be able to take out of this podcast today if they watch to the end?
So today we're going to talk about tactics and tools to launch your law firm in 2025. I know that's kind of a hot topic for everybody. Every attorney kind of has a dream to hang their own shingle, and this is kind of lay the groundwork for the tools that you need to do that.
Sweet. So, why don't we just dive in, man? So, maybe just starting from the top. Obviously, you're doing employment law, but I'm sure you didn't go into law school thinking that you're gonna, and one day end up doing employment law. So, on mastering the practice area, how important do you think is it for attorneys to actually know what they want to open up their practice in as far as practice area goes before they start?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question. So the way it generally works, the legal practice generally is that you go to law school, you end up doing a clerkship in a certain practice area, and then you just end up most people just end up doing that whatever they learned in their 2L year for the rest of their life. Honestly, it's kind of a strange phenomenon because I don't think any other professional school kind of works like that. And so for me, I had a kind of an interesting winding pathway to employment law. I was in tech for 5 years prior to law school, and I went to law school with 100% certainty that I was going to be a public defender, a criminal lawyer. And then essentially what happened was that the realities of criminal law kind of hit me, and I didn't know if it was a good fit for me anymore. And secondly, I just ran out of money. Doing public interest stuff is great, but it does not pay the bills, especially in law school, because those are the unpaid internships. And so, I ran out of money, and then one of my classmates was like, "Hey, I'm interning at a civil law firm. They do employment law, but they need another clerk. Are you in?" And I was like, you know what? Look at my bank account. I'll do anything at this point. So, I started working at that employment law firm, and I stayed there until I passed the bar. And then, fast forward a little bit, when I went solo, I pretty much started doing anything that would, like all types of law. But it wasn't really working out financially because, as I talked about prior, if you do many different areas of law or even all areas of law, if you're trying to do the best for your client, you have to teach yourself a new practice area every time. And so and that's not billable time. So you can't make money for that time that you spend catching yourself up on a practice area. So I quickly realized, well, maybe not quickly enough, that this was not a sustainable business practice. So I went back to what I knew best, which was employment law, because I'd learned it since 3L year from my internship. And so that's a really long background for this question. I don't even know if it answers the question. But an area, a practice area, pretty, at least the mechanics before you go into your, hang your own shingle. Because the issue is when you're starting and running a law firm, you have to be part attorney and part business owner. And the most successful law firm owners are actually the most successful, are better at the business side of it than the legal side. Because I was new, pretty much a fresh attorney, I had to learn how to be an attorney and how to be a business owner at the same time. And that's a very difficult learning curve. So if I were to recommend somebody that wants to do, own their own business, own their own firm, you should know the mechanics of being an attorney in your field before you dive into the business. So you don't have to learn both at the same time because it's very difficult. So it's not a necessary component because I didn't, I knew somewhat employment law, um, but it's gonna be much harder if you don't know a practice area like the back of your hand before you go into practice for yourself. That's a very
Right.
long-winded answer to your question.
No. Yeah, totally makes sense. Yeah. So you're thinking if you're take yourself back to where you were in law school, you probably wouldn't do something where fresh out of law school, you're gonna go jump into in employment law because you heard that there's lots of money in pursuing this, right? You're saying it's still helpful to spend some time actually working in a firm, actually practicing the area. So you have like, one side of the equation kind of figured out.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. And the issue becomes is like how much is enough, right? So a lot of people that I talk to that are, are always talking about going off solo, they're always like, I don't know enough. I don't know enough. I need another year, another 2 more years. The thing is like if you know like the general steps on how a case works from like civil litigation, from like inception intake to trial, that's pretty much all you need to know. The rest you can figure out. How long does it take to know that? I would say, maybe like two, actually at most probably like 5 years, I would say. Someone had told me like 3 to 5 years is when attorneys really start to like hit their stride. And I've kind of seen that with my cohort and group of friends. So, I worked at that firm as an intern for about a year, and then I worked at another firm, another employment law firm for about another 6 to 8 months. So in totality, I probably had about 2 years of experience, but that was from clerking, not just being an attorney. I think like once I was an attorney, if I had spent two years at a plaintiff side firm, I think that would have been I had a much easier time.
So what is it that you're looking for in those like years of experience? Like just maybe like a gut check feeling that like I can probably do a lot of this stuff, like 80% of this workload with my eyes closed. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like what is it
No,
tangible you're feeling for?
I don't think so. I think just like so, talking about civil litigation generally, a case kind of takes a lifestyle of a case is around like 2 years, and so I think the part of the reason that people say it takes 2 to 3 years to really earn your stride is because you can actually see a case from beginning to trial or even through trial in 2 years, right? Because that's just how long it takes in California, with how impacted our courts are. And so once you can see from intake to settlement, like two, three, four, however many cases, you can kind of see the general pathway that a case takes. You know the pitfalls to look for, and in your practice area, you can see like in this case, like I'm looking for this type of evidence. How do I get this type of evidence? Who do I need to depose to get this kind of evidence? So once you've seen that a couple of times, you'll know what to do when you get it, on your own.
Right. Yeah. Just need to see the full life cycle of these cases
Right.
and just get exposure to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all totally brand new. Makes sense. Another question that I had on this topic was, did you do any research on a particular niche? Like obviously personal injury, there's tons of attorneys practicing their own firms in PI, employment also, immigration, different business models. Or is it more like I have again one side of the equation done, I'm going to go make the business work?
So the way that I did it, to be honest with you, when I was doing employment law, and I'd done it for like 2.5 years at the firms, I was kind of like, man, I kind of want to try something else. Like, I'm kind of sick of this. And so, I was like, okay, let me pick up some other cases or whatever they come my way. So I picked up some, immigration cases. I picked up some civil like business civil litigation business defense cases, so I was able to see different areas, different practice areas. And so the interesting thing is that different practice areas have their own like business model, and you have to see if it works for you. So for example, like immigration law, it's all flat fee, usually flat fee work. But the thing is, in immigration law, if you're not doing removal trials or deportation defense, which I have done, and I still have a couple lingering cases of that, it's mostly like filling out forms and just doing it properly. There's a lot of directions, a lot of pages and pages of instructions on how to do these properly. But it's not terribly intensive as opposed to civil litigation or pretty much any type of litigation. But the problem or the issue that I faced with immigration law is that your clientele really matters. And so my clientele, for whatever reason that I was getting, they were they weren't the wealthiest, and so they would always try to haggle on the fees, that's payment plans and all that stuff. And you can do that, but in order to have that as a business model, you need to have enough volume for the ones that do pay to offset that kind of, those losses basically. And I just wasn't getting enough volume in immigration. And the margins weren't as good in my opinion from the uh, the employment cases that I had.
Right.
Um, and the flip side is, so basically what I'm saying is that each practice area has their advantages and disadvantages. The advantages of immigration law is theoretically you get paid up front. You don't have to float the cost for cases until it resolves, right? So, and then on the another case that I took was civil litigation defense. So I was representing a defendant, a business that had gotten sued for something, like maybe like a breach of contract or something, and
Uh,
that's billable. So basically, I would send a invoice every month of like, hey, these are the hours that I worked on your case, so you need to pay me this. For whatever reason, the client, she paid me the first 2 months, and then the third month she was just like, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't pay you. And I was like, what do you mean? I did all this work. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't pay you. And what do you do then? I was like, well, I don't think this is billable work. It's for me. So yeah, it's a long-winded way of answering your question.
so it just kind of depends, right? I think like
Right.
basically short of actually doing it and seeing what works for you, it's kind of hard to tell just from like kind of maybe you can understand based on research and what you know of yourself that you can kind of figure it out. But in your case, you just had to do it and then just see
Yeah.
in your market for your particular area what the type of clients are, what the type of work that you're going to be doing is, and then just go from there to make like a really educated decision.
Yeah. So one thing is that the reason I went back to employment law was because it's what I know best, and so I had a leg up on those kind of cases rather than immigration or any other thing, which I'd have to do research. So I was able to do the employment law cases a lot faster, right, than those other cases because I didn't have to teach myself. And
Right.
so I think one of the best things that you like a solo should do is kind of like do some introspection and be like, okay, what can I do? Like, what do I already know how to do? And what do I know how to do best? So that's one thing. The second thing, it would be to check your network, right? Like, if you are an immigrant and you have a lot of family members or friends that are also immigrants, maybe immigration law is for you because that's what your network is. And, same for like any other practice area. So if you're, let's say, you hang out with a lot of startup founders. Like maybe it makes sense for you to learn corporations and, startup legal stuff, business corporations. Yeah. So you kind of have to like check what you're good at, your skills, and then what your network needs.
Right. So maybe before we jump into like network, I want to double click on this budgeting piece because I feel like this is another huge part of starting a business, any business really, but probably more so for like a law firm, is managing like money, right? Managing the cash flows. So for folks kind of starting their firms and starting their journey here, like what advice do you have as far as like budgeting goes and maintaining cash flows? How important
Yes.
is it and all that?
Yeah. So, a very experienced attorney told me once that it's not about how much money you make; it's about how much money you spend, and there's a lot of truth to that. So basically, you see all these law firms that are posting crazy verdicts, right? Like millions and millions of dollars. But what you don't know is how much of that is profit, because in civil litigation, you have to invest some amount of money to get an output, x multiplied by some coefficient, and that's your output. And the key is to keep those costs relatively sustainable. So costs are very very paramount. So when I started my law firm, I had maybe like $4,000 in my bank account, which I don't recommend. You guys should start your firm with a lot more than that. What is a number? I can't tell you a number. People always ask me like, what's a number that I should hit in my bank account before I go solo? I was like, I don't know, man. Like it really depends, but it gives you some runway. But the thing is, like, it's also a double edged sword. If you have too much money, then like you won't push your cases as much. If you had $200,000 in the bank, you can kind of wait out some of the cases, right? But what I realized is that when I had some money, you get a little bit complacent. You're like, oh, I don't need to take these depots right now. But when you don't have money, you're like, oh, I got to settle some cases. But anyway, back to the point. Costs are always paramount. So one thing I did in the beginning, and I made a lot of mistakes. Basically, I was like, whatever, I'll just put everything on credit card. It doesn't matter. Bad idea. You're gonna have to end up paying the piper. So and there's no, sometimes you need to because you just don't have any more money, right? Business costs add up. But I would recommend everyone that wants to open a firm to, before they do that, to see their personal expenses in a month, what they are, and then try to cut those by 20 to 30%, because it's just going to give you a little bit more cushion when you go out on your own. Because I would say for don't expect to make any money for the first 3 to 5 months as a law firm owner. So one thing that became really, really paramount is taking an accounting of what costs I needed, like what my overhead. So one thing that I did, and this, maybe it wasn't the best thing that I did, but it's the only way I know how. But I had this, my philosophy, the principle was I don't mind spending on subscription software. I was like, you know what? I can't hire anybody because I didn't have the money, but I can always cancel a subscription, right? So I was thinking, okay, I'll get, the service that does this and this, and if I can't afford it, I'll cancel it, right? But in the beginning, I wasn't as judicious. I was like, okay, this sounds cool. I think I could use it. Let's and I think I wasted some money doing that. But as I got more and more sophisticated, I realized I don't actually use this that much. I'm going to cancel the subscription. The other thing that I realized is that whatever software that you're using, there's probably a cheaper alternative that's maybe not as good, but good enough. And so, for example, I used to use Loom, but then after I used Loom a little bit, and Loom's not exactly expensive, but I
Could
used
you
it to make
just quickly go
instructional.
over what Loom is?
Yeah, right. So Loom is a screen capture software where you can basically make a video of doing something on your computer, and then you can share it with your teammates, and it'll be a little snippet. It costs, I think, $15 to $20 a month. So I used it for like a year. I signed up for a year's subscription, and I wasn't using it as much. And then I also found, I think you showed me actually, the
Yeah.
OBS software, and they were like, "Hey, this is free," and I was like, "Oh, free? That's better than $20 a month." And so, but the thing is, you could find that for like a lot of different things. And so, one thing that I did is that once I became more sophisticated, every 2 or 3 months, every quarter, basically, I would review my monthly expenses and say, "Do I really need this cost? Is there a cheaper alternative?" Those are the two questions I would ask. If the answer is, if I didn't need it, then I would cut it. If I did need it, I would look for a cheaper alternative, and then either switch or find a cheaper alternative, compare the two features, and just make the most cost effective decision. It's not always that I'm going to go with the cheaper one,
Right.
but most of the time I did.
Yeah.
But sometimes the features are worth it, right? But anyway, the point is you got to keep your costs at a minimum, your overheads low. And so one example of that is actually QuickBooks. So QuickBooks is accounting software, and I don't know what the deal is with QuickBooks, but they kept raising their prices. It used to be like $20 a month, then $25 a month, then it was like $30 a month, then it was like $35 a month. And I was like, okay, hold on. Whoa. This is getting crazy. And I only looked at it, I only used it before tax season. So, I was paying this monthly cost for what? For using it twice, even though, it was helpful when it did it, but it wasn't worth $40 a month. So an alternative that I found was actually Empower PER Dashboard, which basically does the same thing. It's, of course, not as intuitive and user-friendly as QuickBooks, but you can connect it to your bank accounts, you can connect it to your credit cards, you can tag things and export them as CSVs, and you can find out your costs that way. It gives you a little chart of your cash flow, and it's free. So that was, yeah. So those are that was a game changer for me. I still use PER Dashboard. Now I'm like, why would I ever pay for QuickBooks?
Yeah.
And if you still need, some kind of accounting software and you have those bells and whistles, there's FreshBooks, there's other things. I think there's something called Wave, something like that. It's cheaper. So don't always go for the most well-known software in that space. You can always look for cheaper alternatives because costs are absolutely paramount in owning your own business.
Yeah,
Wow,
I
these
think
are some really long answers.
yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate all the context. I think that's a definitely I think something that we've seen also on the software space is that there's always going to be varieties of products. Some of them are super user friendly, very easy to use, but they'll charge a premium for that. And then sometimes you can just like pour more time into some software that's free in general, like Google Docs or Notion, and you can make it work. It's just going to take a little bit of your time. So just depending on where you are and where you want to optimize, you have lots of options, which is cool. Going back to your kind of original point there on like starting and thinking of like how to make that leap. I think every business kind of needs this. And this is where like the business side of starting a law firm really comes in, is you have to have some runway to work on your business while you're getting getting the flywheel going. And sometimes that's 6 months, sometimes that's a year. And then the way you can extend that is like you have the savings, but also you limit your monthly expense, like you're saying, like 20-30%. You do those two things, you're able to extend out the period where you can try out, back to our previous point, different practice areas, try different cases, try different business models. And that sounds kind of like what your experiences was when you were starting.
Yeah. Another thing that I did is that I did contract work. I contracted out with a couple of attorneys that had cases that I wanted to work on, that they needed people to work on, and I even contracted some cases from this attorney on a percentage basis. So
Yeah.
he wouldn't pay me flat fee, but he was saying like, if you settle this case, I'll pay all the costs of the case, and I'll give you, I think it was like, forget exactly their attorney fee split, maybe like 40% of the attorney's fees. I forgot exactly what the split was. I do remember the overall calculation. It ended up being like 11% of the total settlement. And so what, if it was $100,000, I would get, like
Right.
$11,000.
Yeah.
That was actually very valuable for me, not because of the money. I knew I was losing money on this case, but I did work with and a very experienced employment attorney, and I kind of saw how he did things, and it was really helpful for me to have worked at or seen how three different plaintiff attorneys work, because everybody does everything their own way. There are general things that have to be done, but beyond those like requirements in a case, everyone has their own style. And so I was able to see, from my first firm how they did things, my second firm how they did things, and then how this guy did things when I co-counseled with him on a contract basis. And I now, kind of have my own style, which is kind of an amalgamation of how they work. So it's good to see how different people in the space do things.
Yeah. That's a great segue to what I want to talk about next, which is the networking piece, right? So obviously it's great to get more experience. If you do need to extend your runway while you're figuring out the business, how to find people to like even clerk for in the first place. I think a lot of that comes down to just having a good network. So maybe we can jump into that. How did you meet these folks? How are you getting in touch with them? What does, in your mind, active networking look like to you?
Yeah. So, I was never a big networking guy. I always thought networking was kind of BS. I was like, yeah, whatever, I'll figure it out. But that was, before owning my own business. Now I realize that networking is what gonna make or break you. But the thing is, like, networking is so vast. Like, it's such a broad term. And it can mean anything. And everyone has their own style of networking. Like, I'm not that guy that, like, goes on LinkedIn and says, hey, like, look at how cool I am. Look at this case I just settled for all this money. I'm awesome, right? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just not that guy. You know what I mean? So for me, what networking ended up being was me like offering to do work for like for a lower rate. Like, so when I was contracting, I was a fresher attorney, and I kept my rates pretty low. I reached out to, like, SELA. I'm part of the Muslim Bar Association. I send like an email blast like, hey, I'm a solo attorney. I have some bandwidth. I'm willing to take some overflow work from anybody for a reasonable rate that's negotiable. And you know, attorneys have tons of work, right? Any established attorney will have a lot of work, and they're just like begging for it to get done because they want to do it. There's so many. There's so much. And so I got some cases there to work on contract work. And so my way of networking was to offer my services. And it was like there was a double impact to it because I was also able to learn different areas. Like, I did some contract cases in civil litigation. I think I did maybe one or two immigration cases, and I kind of saw how the supervising attorneys did things. But my way of networking was to offer my services at at a lower rate so that I can learn. And, it makes me more attractive to people because it's a low rate. And then as time went on, I increased my rate. as my skills grew. So I would say, in the beginning, that's what you're gonna have to do. Like, I was willing to not get um, the top of the line market rate just so I can learn.
Yeah.
So in the very beginning, and it kind of goes back to what you said about owning your own business. In most businesses at the infancy stage of any business, you have a lot of time and you don't have any money. So you can like trade time for the lack of money, right? Like you said, you can research, learn how to do things. You can look into those softwares that are less user friendly, but they don't charge a premium, but you have the time to do that, right? And so, for me, you can even like build out your own website. There's like YouTube videos on how to build out your own website. You don't have to hire somebody if you have that kind of time. So yeah, it's all about trading your time to make up for the lack of resources that you have.
This is one thing I think is pretty interesting and maybe pretty funny is that networking doesn't mean like you DM an attorney and be like, hey, I just want to pick your brain. Hey, I want to grab coffee. They're extremely busy. And you are too, probably, right? But if it's, everyone's at different steps on the business ladder. And so to get to that point, you had to kind of offer something interesting, right? So in your case, it was legal work at a bit of a discounted rate. And
Yeah,
now it's mutually beneficial. I think that's a really important point that gets missed quite a bit. It's not just hanging around alumni events and then just trying to chit chat. You
right.
have like a goal, right? Like you had a desire to like get this particular outcome, and then you kind of worked towards that. Did you try anything else? Like you mentioned like Sila, you mentioned some other groups. How did you come across those? Like what was going through your mind when you're looking at different associations to join?
So Sila, I was a member when I was at my other firms. They paid for a membership, but Sila's huge. So the thing about bar associations is that less is more. What I realized is that the bar associations, the ones that are really big, you're just a small fish in a big pond. You know what I mean? And so it's harder to network in the bigger ones. They're good for other things. They'll have motions and practice guides and stuff like that. But in order having like meaningful relationships with other attorneys, connecting with people, that's tougher on the bigger ones. So I would suggest is finding kind of like the smaller bar associations that are more intimate, and they're bar associations for everything. Like there's like I said, the SoCal Muslim Bar Association that I'm part of. That was like a smaller group, more tight knit. And so when I sent out an email blast, like people responded and like, hey, like I need work done. What's your rate? Blah blah blah. So yeah, that was part of the things that I did, and that's something that I suggest to a lot of newer attorneys or new solos is to find like the smaller bar associations and be useful to them. Offer to do work at a discounted rate, and then people will take you up on it.
Do you think that newer attorneys, newer lawyers underestimate how important this aspect is to growing their business?
As in networking.
Yeah, just networking, reaching out to people, building kind of a Rolodex of other attorneys, right? Maybe they're in the same place, maybe in the same practice area, maybe they're not.
Yeah. So another thing that I forgot to mention, but it comes to my mind now. Whatever your practice area is, brainstorm an adjacent practice area where those type of cases can turn into your cases, right? So, for example, I do employment law. Part of employment law is disability discrimination. And that's a natural. So, disability discrimination is when you get treated differently at work for a disability. And a disability in California is very broadly defined. It can be anything that limits a substantial life activity. So, that could be any kind of illness, any injury. And so, a really close adjacent practice area to that is workers' comp law. So, workers' comp is compensation for actually getting hurt at work. Um, but so that's workers' comp law. But employment law is getting retaliated for getting hurt at work because you got hurt at work. And so what I did was, I reached out to workers' comp attorneys, and I was like, hey, like, I'm Fahim, I'm an employment lawyer, and I do this, I do a lot of disability discrimination cases. If you have any of that, send them my way. And the other way around, I sent them cases. I was like, when I get a case, that has someone who was hurt at work, I sent him over to the workers' comp people. And so another good way of networking is just send referral fees in adjacent practice areas and network with attorneys in practice areas that are similar to yours that can lead to your cases and have a referral relationship.
Awesome, man. I think we covered quite a bit here. So we went over like choosing a practice area, thinking about budgeting, and then networking also in that kind of 0 to 1 phase. I think there's a lot of good information here that hopefully attorneys can walk away with something valuable. Any closing thoughts, man, on these kind of three areas that we went over?
So the main thing I want to close with, and when it comes to networking, is you have to like add value to someone that you're networking with, right? So when you're when you cold email somebody on LinkedIn, like, hey, I'm Fahim, I'm an attorney in employment law. Love to pick your brain. Can I buy you a coffee? Yeah, sure, that's great. And sometimes maybe you'll get a hit or two. But if you're saying, hey, I'm offering to do work for a discounted rate, or I'm offering to give you money through a referral agreement, you're going to look that much more attractive in networking, right? So you have to kind of make yourself attractive. Why should this person that you're trying to connect with, why should they network with you? You have to incentivize that, right? So for me, that was like, okay, I offer referral fees and I offered to do work at a discounted rate. So those things made me really attractive to people, and that's how I was able to kind of grow my network.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate the time today. Hopefully, for you all listening, you walked away with something valuable here. But until next time, thanks for tuning in.